The steam from Sophie's coffee cup spiraled upward, disappearing into the warm amber light that hung over the small corner table. Outside, the first snow of December dusted the Seattle streets with a gentle persistence that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. The cafe buzzed with the quiet energy of a Thursday afternoon. Students hunched over laptops, business people checking phones between sips of lattes, the soft clatter of ceramic and conversation creating a familiar symphony she'd grown to love over the past 3 years of coming here. She traced the rim of her mug with her index finger, watching the foam slowly dissolve into the dark liquid beneath. At 62, Sophie had learned to find comfort in small rituals, in the predictable warmth of her usual corner seat, in the way the barista, Emma, a college student with kind eyes, always remembered her order without being asked. Caramel macchiato, extra shot, no whip. Simple things that anchored her to the present when her mind had a tendency to drift backward into territories she'd spent decades trying to navigate. The letter sat folded in her purse, the paper soft with age and countless readings. She'd carried it with her for 47 years, through 2 marriages, 3 moves across the country, the birth and raising of 2 children, and the quiet rebuilding of a life after her second husband's death 18 months ago. The handwriting had faded, but remained legible. The words as vivid as the day she'd first read them in her childhood bedroom in Spokane, her hands trembling with 17-year-old hope and heartbreak. Dear Sophie, I don't know if you remember me. We never met, but you wrote to me for 3 years during the war. Your letters kept me alive when I thought I wouldn't make it home. I've been looking for you ever since I came back. I know it's been decades and maybe you've forgotten, but I never could. If you get this, I'll be waiting at Pike Place Market every December 15th at noon for the next 5 years. I hope you're happy. I hope you found everything you were looking for. With all my love, Adam. She'd found the letter slipped under her apartment door 3 weeks ago. No envelope, no return address. Just her name written in that same careful script she remembered from the single letter she'd received from him in 1976. The handwriting that had made her cry in a grocery store checkout line, remembering the boy she'd never met but had loved with the fierce intensity only possible at 17. Sophie pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders and checked her watch. 2:15. She'd been sitting here for over an hour, nursing the same coffee, watching the snow accumulate on the window ledge, and wondering if she'd lost her mind. Pike Place Market was only 6 blocks away. December 15th. Tomorrow. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up automatically, a habit formed from years of people-watching in this same spot. A man entered, shaking snow from his grey coat, his movements careful but purposeful. Something about the way he paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with quiet intensity, made her chest tighten. He was tall, probably her age, with silver hair that caught the light and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Their eyes met across the crowded cafe. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She knew those eyes, blue-grey, like storm clouds over water. She'd imagined them countless times while writing letters to a soldier she'd never seen, a boy from her hometown who'd been drafted straight out of high school and assigned to her through the military pen pal program her church had organized. She'd been 17, he'd been 18, and for 3 years she'd poured her heart into weekly letters filled with small-town news, her dreams of college, her fears about the future, her slowly growing feelings for someone she'd never met. He moved toward her table with the careful gait of someone whose body had carried him through more than most, and she realized she was holding her breath. This couldn't be coincidence. Not here. Not the day before their planned meeting, not when she'd been carrying his letter like a talisman for 3 weeks. Sophie. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, roughened by time and whatever stories lived in the spaces between then and now. Sophie Allen? She managed to nod, though her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely. Up close, she could see the boy she'd fallen in love with through letters, in the shape of his mouth, in the way he held his shoulders. But there were other things too. A scar along his left temple, the careful way he favored his right leg, the shadows behind his eyes that spoke of wars that didn't end when the fighting stopped. "You still don't remember me." The words came out barely above a whisper, and Sophie realized with a start that they were the same words she'd been planning to say to him tomorrow at the market. As if he'd read her mind, as if the 47 years between them had compressed into this single moment of recognition. "I remember." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I remember everything. Adam, because it had to be Adam." Even though logic told her this was impossible, remained standing beside her table, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded her of the military bearing she'd imagined when she was 17. Snow continued to fall outside the window, and the cafe sound seemed to fade into background noise. "May I?" He gestured to the chair across from her. "Please." Ma, he settled into the seat with the careful movements of someone managing old injuries, and Sophie found herself studying his face with an intensity that might have been rude under other circumstances. This was the face that had haunted her dreams during the war years, the face she'd tried to imagine while writing letter after letter about her life in Spokane, her job at the library, her worries about him in a jungle on the other side of the world. "I wasn't sure you'd kept writing," he said, his hands resting flat on the small table between them. "After the war ended, when the program stopped, I thought maybe you'd moved on." Sophie shook her head. "I kept writing for 2 more years. I didn't know where to send them." She paused, remembering the stack of unsent letters she'd finally buried in her mother's garden when she was 22 and engaged to Robert. "I kept writing until I couldn't anymore." Something passed across Adam's face. Relief, maybe, or an old grief finally acknowledged. "I came back different," he said simply. "It took me a long time to remember who I was before. By the time I was ready to find you, you'd moved away, no forwarding address." The snow was falling heavier now, and Sophie watched it accumulate on the window while she processed this information. She'd moved to California in 1975, right after college, chasing a job and a boy who'd promised her everything and delivered mostly heartbreak. She'd married Robert in 78, had Sarah in 81, and Michael in 83, built a life that was good and solid, and nothing like the dreams she'd shared in those wartime letters. "I looked for you," she said, meeting his eyes again. "In the phone books, through the church, through the Veterans Administration. They said there was no record of an Adam Parker from Spokane who'd served in Vietnam." There wouldn't have been," Adam replied, his voice carrying a weight that made Sophie lean forward slightly. "Parker wasn't my real name. Security protocols. Most of the pen pal program used aliases to protect families back home." The revelation hit Sophie like a physical blow. 47 years she'd been carrying the name Adam Parker, weaving it into her memories and dreams, and it had never been real. "What's your real name?" "Adam Morrison." He smiled for the first time since sitting down, and Sophie felt her heart perform some complicated gymnastics routine in her chest. "Adam James Morrison. I was born on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the library where you worked." Sophie stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she'd been solving suddenly clicking into place. "Morrison, there was a family. I remember now. They moved away right before the war started. Dad got transferred to Portland for work. I graduated from high school there, got drafted there." Adam's fingers drummed silently on the table. "When I signed up for the pen pal program, they assigned me back to Spokane randomly. I never told them I was from there originally." The irony was staggering. Sophie had spent 3 years writing love letters to a boy from her own hometown without knowing it, pouring her heart out to someone who'd probably walked the same streets she had, who'd known the same hills and weather patterns and small-town rhythms that had shaped her childhood. Emma, the young barista, appeared beside their table with a concerned expression. "Sophie, you've been here a while. Can I get you anything else? Maybe something for your friend?" "Coffee," Adam said, looking up at her with the same gentle attention he'd given Sophie. "Black, please. And maybe a refill for me," Sophie added, realizing her mug had gone cold while she processed this revelation about names and identities and the strange mathematics of coincidence. Emma nodded and retreated, and Sophie found herself alone again with Adam Morrison, who used to be Adam Parker, who had been 18 when she fell in love with him through letters and was now 65. Sitting across from her in a Seattle café while snow fell outside and her entire understanding of her own history rearranged itself. "How did you find me?" she asked. "After all this time?" Adam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful quality of someone who'd rehearsed these words many times. "I never stopped looking. When the internet came along, it got easier. Social media, public records, obituaries." He paused. "I'm sorry about your husband, both of them." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You've been watching me?" "Not watching. Just keeping track, making sure you were okay. It sounds creepy when I say it like that." Adam ran a hand through his silver hair. "I had this idea that maybe someday I'd work up the courage to contact you, but then you always seemed so settled, so happy. I didn't want to disrupt that." Emma returned with Adam's coffee and Sophie's refill, setting them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read the emotional temperature of conversations. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on. The laptop students packing up to beat the snow, the business crowd returning to their offices. Sophie wrapped her hands around her fresh mug, using the warmth to steady herself. "What changed? Why now?" "My daughter found your letters." The words hit Sophie with unexpected force. Adam had a daughter, of course he did. 47 years was a long time, long enough for full lives and families and stories that didn't include her. She'd known this intellectually, but hearing it stated so plainly made her realize she'd been carrying some small, irrational hope that he'd been waiting for her all this time. "She was helping me clean out my father's house after he died last spring," Adam continued. "The letters were in a box in the basement. Dad must have kept them all these years without telling me." His voice grew softer. "Rachel, that's my daughter. She read some of them. She said anyone who could write letters like that deserved to know what happened to the person who kept them." Sophie felt her throat tighten. She'd forgotten how earnest those letters had been, how full of 17-year-old passion and hope and grand declarations about love and life and the future. The idea of Adam's daughter reading them, of a stranger seeing that raw, emotional honesty, made her want to disappear under the table. "She drove me to Seattle 3 weeks ago and helped me find your address," Adam said. "The letter was her idea, too. She thought I should give you the choice of whether to meet. And tomorrow, the market. That was my idea. December 15th was the date on your last letter, the one you sent right before you graduated high school." Adam smiled again, and Sophie caught a glimpse of the 18-year-old boy who'd made her believe in love through written words. "I thought maybe you'd remember." Sophie did remember. She'd written that final letter in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes packed for college, trying to find a way to say goodbye to someone she'd never actually said hello to. She'd promised to write when she got settled in California, promised to find a way to reach him when the war ended, promised things she'd been too young to understand she couldn't keep. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "I did try to find you." "I know." Adam reached across the table and after a moment's hesitation placed his hand over hers. His skin was warm and slightly rough, the hand of someone who'd worked with his hands, and Sophie felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the present moment. "I found the investigator you hired in 1984. He called me about 10 years ago, thinking I might be related to the Adam Parker you were looking for." The touch of his hand was doing strange things to Sophie's ability to think clearly. She'd been married to good men, men she'd loved deeply, but there was something about this connection that felt like coming home to a place she'd never actually been. "You could have contacted me then. You were married, happy, your kids were in college, your husband had just started his own business." Adam's thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "I was dealing with my own stuff. My wife had just been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The timing was all wrong." Sophie felt her heart clench. "I'm sorry. She was a good woman. We had 28 years together before she forgot who I was." Adam's voice carried the particular sadness of someone who'd learned to live with loss. "She died 3 years ago. Peaceful, finally." They sat in silence for a moment, hands connected across the small table, while the weight of all their separate histories settled between them. Outside, the snow had begun to stick to the sidewalks, and the early December darkness was starting to gather at the edges of the windows. "What now?" Sophie asked, surprising herself with the question. She'd spent the last 3 weeks assuming that tomorrow's meeting would be a brief, polite conversation with closure as its only goal. The reality of Adam Morrison sitting across from her, of his hand warm over hers, of 47 years collapsing into this single afternoon, had changed something fundamental about what she thought was possible. "I don't know," Adam admitted. "I spent so long imagining this conversation that I never planned past it." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Do you ever think about the people we might have been, if the timing had been different?" Sophie did think about it. She thought about it more often than she cared to admit, especially in the month since David's death, when the house felt too quiet and her days stretched out with a purposelessness that frightened her. She thought about the girl who'd written love letters to a soldier, who'd believed in grand romantic gestures and fate and the power of words to bridge any distance. "Sometimes," she said. "Do you? Every day since I found your letters again." Adam's honesty was disarming, the kind of straightforward emotional truth that Sophie remembered from his letters during the war. "I know it's crazy. I know we're different people now than we were then. But sitting here with you, it doesn't feel like 47 years. It feels like coming back to something I never really left behind." Sophie felt tears gathering behind her eyes, a complex mixture of grief and hope and something that might have been relief. "I used to dream about you for years after the war ended. I dreamed that you came to find me, that you'd remember my address and show up at my door with flowers and explanations." "What did Dream Me say?" "That you'd been looking for me too. That the war had changed you, but not the way you felt about me. That we could start over and build something real out of all those letters." Sophie laughed softly, embarrassed by the admission. 17-year-old dreams. Maybe not so 17. Adam lifted their joined hands slightly, turning them so he could see the wedding ring she still wore on her right hand, the simple gold band David had given her 12 years ago. "Are you ready for this to be over? The waiting and wondering?" Sophie understood that he was asking about more than just tomorrow's meeting at Pike Place Market. He was asking about the possibility of beginning something new, of taking the foundation they'd built in letters decades ago and seeing what could be constructed on top of it now. The question terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Start over at 62, figure out how to love someone new." "Maybe it's not about starting over," Adam suggested. "Maybe it's about continuing something we never really finished." The cafe had grown significantly quieter, and Sophie realized they'd been talking for over 2 hours. The snow outside had transformed Seattle into something softer and more forgiving, muffling the usual city sounds and wrapping the familiar streets in temporary magic. A few other customers remained, a couple sharing a piece of cake, an elderly man reading a newspaper, 2 women deep in conversation near the window. But the afternoon rush had ended, leaving behind the kind of intimate atmosphere that made private revelations feel possible. "Tell me about your life," Sophie said, realizing she wanted to know everything about the man Adam had become, not just the boy she'd loved through letters. "Your daughter, your work, what you do when you're not searching for long-lost pen pals." Adam smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that made Sophie's chest flutter. "Rachel's 35. She's a nurse practitioner in Portland, married to a good man named James, who makes her laugh every day. They have 2 kids. Emma's 8. Jack's 5. His voice carried the particular warmth reserved for beloved grandchildren. "Rachel looks like her mother, but has my stubborn streak. She's the one who convinced me to write that letter." Sophie found herself smiling in return. What did she say? That I'd spent my whole marriage being faithful to my wife, and my whole widowhood being faithful to a memory, and maybe it was time to see what being faithful to the present might look like. Adam shook his head, clearly still surprised by his daughter's directness. "She can be pretty persuasive when she wants to be." "And work?" "I taught high school English for 32 years, retired 5 years ago." Adam paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I used to read your letters to my creative writing classes. Not the personal parts, just the sections where you describe Spokane, your dreams about college, the way you saw the world. You had a gift for making ordinary things sound extraordinary." The revelation sent warmth spreading through Sophie's chest. She'd forgotten about those descriptive passages, the way she'd tried to paint pictures with words for a boy she'd never met, but wanted desperately to know. "You kept them that long?" "I kept them forever. They're in a box in my bedroom, along with the photograph you sent." Adam's eyes grew distant. "You were beautiful, Sophie. You still are, but you were luminous in that picture. 17 and fearless and so alive." Sophie remembered that photograph, her senior portrait, the one her mother had insisted on even though money was tight. She'd sent it with one of her final letters, along with a small pressed flower from her mother's garden and a promise to love him until she was old and grey. "I wasn't fearless," she said softly. "I was terrified most of the time. Terrified you wouldn't write back. Terrified you'd be hurt. Terrified the war would never end and I'd never get to meet you. But you kept writing. I kept writing." Sophie studied Adam's face, noting the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the small scar near his left ear, the gentle way he held his shoulders as if he were always prepared to catch something falling. "What about you? Were you really okay over there?" Adam was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing patterns across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful quality of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult territory. "No, not really. But your letters helped. When things got bad, I'd read them over and over until I could imagine I was in Spokane with you, walking through your neighborhood, sitting in the library where you worked. You gave me somewhere to go when where I was became unbearable." The weight of this confession settled between them. Sophie had known, intellectually, that her letters had meant something to Adam during the war, but she'd never fully understood the extent to which her words had served as a lifeline. The responsibility felt enormous and humbling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry you had to go through that alone. I wasn't alone, I had you." Adam lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender and unexpected that Sophie felt tears spring to her eyes. "I've wanted to tell you that for 47 years. The simple intimacy of the gesture broke something open in Sophie's chest. She'd been holding herself carefully since David's death, maintaining composure and independence and the kind of dignified widowhood that her children expected from her. But sitting here with Adam, feeling the warmth of his mouth against her skin, she remembered what it felt like to be someone's beloved, to matter to another person in ways that went beyond duty or familial obligation. "Adam," she whispered, and he looked up to meet her eyes. The expression on his face was so openly vulnerable, so full of hope and desire and careful tenderness, that Sophie felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "I know this is complicated," he said, lowering her hand, but not releasing it. "I know we have entire lives to reconcile, children who don't know about each other, expectations and obligations, and all the practical details of being 62 and 65 instead of 17 and 18. Sophie nodded, acknowledging the truth of this, even as part of her wanted to dismiss all practical considerations in favor of the extraordinary feeling of being seen and known by someone who'd loved her before she'd fully known herself. "But I need you to understand something," Adam continued, his voice growing more certain. "I've loved you for 47 years. Not the idea of you, not the memory of you, but you. The person who wrote those letters, who saw beauty in ordinary things, who worried about a boy she'd never met and made him feel less alone in the world. That person is sitting across from me right now, and she's even more remarkable than I remembered." Sophie felt a tear slip down her cheek, followed by another. "You don't know me now. I'm not 17 anymore. I'm not full of dreams and possibilities. I'm just—" "You're just what?" "Tired," she admitted. "Tired and ordinary, and scared of starting over again." Adam reached up and gently wiped the tears from her face with his thumb, the gesture so instinctively caring that Sophie leaned into his touch. "What if we don't call it starting over? What if we call it continuing?" "Continuing what?" "This conversation, the one we started in letters when we were kids and never really finished." Adam's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "We don't have to figure everything out today. We just have to decide if we want to keep talking." Sophie closed her eyes and let herself imagine what that might look like. Coffee dates in this same cafe, long phone calls in the evening, the slow process of learning who they'd become in the decades since they'd known each other through letters. It wouldn't be simple. She lived in Seattle. He lived somewhere else. She realized she didn't even know where. They had children who would need explanations, friends who would have opinions, the complicated logistics of two established lives trying to find space for each other. But underneath all those practical considerations was something simpler and more fundamental. The recognition she'd felt the moment their eyes met across the cafe, the sense of coming home to someone she'd never stopped loving. "Where do you live now?" she asked, opening her eyes to find Adam watching her with patient attention. "Portland, about 3 hours away." He smiled. "Close enough for weekend visits. Far enough that we'd have to be intentional about seeing each other." Sophie felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. "You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks." Adam's honesty was both disarming and endearing. "I've imagined every possible version of this conversation, from you calling security, to you running away, to you falling into my arms, like something out of a movie. This version, talking, really talking, this is better than anything I imagined." The snow was still falling outside, heavier now, and Sophie realized the cafe would probably close soon. They'd been sitting here for hours, lost in conversation and the strange time suspension that happened when two people recognized each other across decades of separation. She didn't want it to end, didn't want to return to her empty apartment and the careful routine of widowhood she'd constructed over the past 18 months. "Are you staying in Seattle tonight?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. I have a room at a hotel downtown. I was planning to stay through tomorrow in case—" Adam paused, seeming to search for the right words. "In case you decided to meet me at the market. And if I had, what would you have said?" Adam was quiet for a moment, his hand still warm against her face. "I would have said that I loved you then and I love you now, and I'd like the chance to love you better than I knew how to in letters." The simplicity and directness of this declaration took Sophie's breath away. She'd spent 2 marriages learning that love could be complicated and conditional, subject to the pressures of daily life and unmet expectations and the slow erosion of dreams deferred. But Adam was offering something different. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the considered love of someone who'd had decades to understand what mattered. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of me? Of this? Of caring about someone again? Of risking my heart after I thought I was done with all that?" Sophie took a shaky breath. "Of being hurt, or hurting you, or discovering that reality can't live up to 47 years of wondering?" Adam nodded, his expression serious. "I'm scared too, terrified actually. But I'm more scared of spending whatever years I have left wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Sophie watched it accumulate on the window ledge while she considered the choice in front of her. She could say goodbye now, return to her safe and predictable life, carry the memory of this afternoon as a beautiful epilogue to a story that had begun in wartime letters. Or she could lean into the unknown, trust that the foundation they'd built as teenagers might be strong enough to support whatever they could build now. "What would we do?" she asked. "Where would we start?" "Dinner," Adam said immediately, and Sophie laughed at the practical simplicity of it. "Tonight, if you're willing, somewhere we can talk more, somewhere we can figure out what comes next." Sophie felt something ease in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Dinner was manageable. Dinner was a single evening, not a lifetime commitment, not a complete reorganization of her carefully constructed independence. "I'd like that," she said, and watched Adam's face transform with relief and joy. "Really? Really?" Sophie felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "But I should warn you, I'm not the same girl who wrote you letters about her dreams of seeing the world. I'm a grandmother who goes to bed early and worries about her cholesterol and has opinions about the proper way to load a dishwasher." Adam laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "And I'm not the 18-year-old soldier you wrote to. I'm a retired teacher who takes medication for his blood pressure and falls asleep in front of the television more often than I care to admit." "We're a mess," Sophie observed. "We're perfect," Adam countered, and the conviction in his voice made Sophie believe for the first time in months that he might be right. Emma appeared beside their table again, this time with the apologetic expression that meant closing time. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're closing in about 15 minutes. Sophie looked around and realized they were the only customers left in the café. The snow outside had transformed the familiar Seattle street into something from a Christmas card, all soft edges and romantic lighting that made even the bus stops look magical. "Of course," she said, beginning to gather her purse and coat. "We lost track of time." "Thank you," Adam said to Emma, leaving a generous tip on the table. "This is an important conversation." Emma's expression softened. "Take your time finishing up. I'll start closing the kitchen first." When she'd retreated, Adam stood and helped Sophie into her coat, the simple courtesy making her feel cherished in a way that reminded her of her teenage dreams about romance. His hands lingered on her shoulders for a moment, and Sophie found herself leaning back against his chest, surprised by how natural the contact felt. "Sophie," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. She turned in his arms. Suddenly aware that they were standing very close together, that his hands had moved to frame her face, that he was looking at her with an expression of such tender intensity that her knees felt slightly unsteady. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "Can I kiss you? I know it's forward. I know we just found each other again, but I've been wanting to kiss you since I was 18 years old. And I don't think I can walk out of here without at least asking." Sophie felt her breath catch. The request was so gentle, so respectful, so completely different from the demanding passion she remembered from her youth. This was the question of a man who understood consent and patience, who valued her comfort over his own desires. "Yes," she whispered, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Adam leaned down slowly, giving her plenty of time to change her mind, and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that made her feel 17 again. The kiss was soft and careful and full of 47 years of wondering, and when they finally separated, Sophie felt dizzy with the realization that some things were worth waiting for. "Wow," she breathed, and Adam smiled against her forehead. "Worth the wait? Worth everything." Sophie looked up into his eyes and saw her own wonder reflected back at her. "Dinner, you said?" "Dinner. And maybe tomorrow we'll skip the market and just spend the day talking." Adam helped her adjust her coat and scarf, his movements gentle and attentive. "I want to know everything about the life you built, the person you became. I want to understand how the girl who wrote me letters grew up to be the woman who makes my heart race in a Seattle cafe." Sophie felt tears threatening again, but these were different tears, tears of gratitude and possibility instead of grief and regret. "I want that too." They walked to the door together, Adam's hand resting gently on the small of her back, and paused on the threshold. Outside, Seattle had been transformed by snow into something soft and magical, the kind of winter evening that made anything seem possible. "Are you ready?" Adam asked, and Sophie understood that he was asking about more than just venturing into the snow. She looked up at him, this man who'd carried her letters through a war and searched for her across decades, who'd found her exactly when she needed to be found and offered her a second chance at a love story she'd thought was finished. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. They stepped out into the snowy Seattle night together, two people who'd loved each other as children and found each other as adults, ready to discover what came next in a story that had begun with wartime letters and was continuing with the courage to believe in love at any age. The cafe door closed behind them with a gentle chime, and Emma, watching from behind the counter, smiled as she witnessed the beginning of something that looked very much like a miracle wrapped in winter coats and 47 years of patience. 3 blocks away, Sophie's apartment waited in darkness. The life she'd carefully constructed since David's death, temporarily abandoned in favor of something far more uncertain and infinitely more alive. In her purse, the letter from Adam Parker, from Adam Morrison, rested against her reading glasses and house keys, the paper soft with age, but the promise within it, finally, impossibly fulfilled. The snow continued to fall as they walked toward whatever restaurant they'd find, toward whatever conversation awaited them, toward the slow and careful process of learning to love each other, not as the teenagers they'd been, but as the people they'd become. And for the first time since she'd found that letter under her door 3 weeks ago, Sophie felt certain that some stories were worth waiting a lifetime to finish. Behind them, the warm light from the cafe window cast a golden rectangle on the snow-covered sidewalk, illuminating their footprints as they walked away together into the kind of winter evening that made even practical 62-year-old women believe in the possibility of happy endings that arrived exactly when they were supposed to, exactly when the heart was finally ready to receive them. 2 months later, Sophie stood in her kitchen making coffee for two, watching the February rain streak down the window, while Adam read the morning paper at her small dining table. The routine had developed gradually. Weekend visits that stretched into week-long stays, phone calls that lasted hours, the slow integration of two separate lives into something that resembled a shared future. "Listen to this," Adam said, looking up from the newspaper with the kind of smile that still made Sophie's heart flutter. "There's an article about a veteran reuniting with his wartime pen pal after 50 years. They met at a library in Chicago." Sophie carried their coffee to the table and settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Are we becoming a trend? Maybe we're just part of something that's always existed. People finding their way back to each other." Adam reached for her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Rachel hadn't found those letters?" Sophie considered this while she watched steam rise from her mug. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually. You sound certain." "I am certain. Some things are meant to happen, even if they take 47 years. Outside, the Seattle rain created the kind of grey afternoon that made staying inside feel like a gift rather than a limitation. Sophie's apartment had slowly transformed to accommodate Adam's presence, his reading glasses on the coffee table, his coffee mug, the blue one she'd bought specifically for him, in the dishwasher, his jacket hanging beside hers in the closet. They hadn't talked about marriage, or moving in together, or any of the practical arrangements that others their age might feel pressured to decide quickly. Instead, they were learning to love each other in the present tense, without the urgency of youth, but with the patience that came from understanding how precious and fragile happiness could be. "My daughter called this morning," Sophie said, settling more comfortably against Adam's shoulder. "Sarah wants to meet you next weekend. Are you ready for that?" Sophie smiled at the careful way he asked, the respect he showed for her pace and comfort level. "I think so. She's curious about the man who's been making her mother laugh again." Adam pressed a kiss to the top of her head, another gesture that had become routine and precious. "And what did you tell her about me?" "That you're someone I used to know who turned out to be someone I needed to know better." They sat together in comfortable silence, reading different sections of the paper and sharing occasional observations about the world outside their quiet morning ritual. This, Sophie thought, was what she'd been missing during her careful widowhood, not just the romance, but the companionship, the easy intimacy of shared space and comfortable quiet. "I love you," Adam said suddenly, looking up from the sports section with the kind of direct honesty that still took Sophie's breath away. "I love you too," she replied, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest like warmth spreading through cold hands. Outside, Seattle continued its rainy February routine, but inside Sophie's small apartment, two people who'd loved each other as teenagers and found each other as adults sat drinking coffee and reading the paper and planning a future that felt both brand new and like the continuation of a story that had been waiting 47 years to reach its proper ending. And in a box in Adam's hotel room, and later in a place of honor on Sophie's bookshelf, the letters they'd written as teenagers remained as proof that some loves are strong enough to survive decades, that some stories are worth waiting for, and that it's never too late to discover that the best part of your life might still be ahead of you.